are already live streaming. And I will start the recording and then start us. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Setting the Stage for Integration, Indivisibility, and Interlinkage. This is a high-level political forum side event for the United Nations. And I'm Dr. Joni Carley. I'm your moderator today. And not only are we doing this as a UN program, we're also pushing this out over Facebook, over 100 pages. And so for those of you who are not part of the UN ecosystem, the High-Level Political Forum is a yearly event when the Sustainable Development Goals are reviewed and the work is really done during this week and a half, 2 weeks every July. And so this is an official High-Level Political Forum program, but we're thrilled to have you here as part of it. And we want to give thanks to Sign Network for making it possible to share this session, not just with UN friends, but with a global audience. And we want to encourage those of you who are in the Zoom room to please use the hand raising and mute and all of that Zoom stuff. So the UN call for proposals for this event mentioned 4 of the goals that are going to be reviewed this year, but it also wanted input on integration, indivisibility, and interlinkage. And we saw that as very specific to the lane that we cover. So we're thrilled to be in that lane. And there are very few people in that lane because it is a unique and unusual place to be speaking. So our intervention today is aimed at establishing a scientific basis for our interdependence. And a basis that's coherent with major religions, with major spiritual and indigenous traditions as well. And we want to address how the emerging understanding and the breakthrough research that's coming out in science now supports a different, more unitive, more scientifically based narrative. And that narrative is way more coherent with first principles in the UN Charter, way more coherent with major religious and spiritual traditions. And so we want to lay that ground. That's our setting the stage today. We're going to establish foundational ground. The word I like to use is ontology, ontological ground. Ontology is the study of the ground of our being. We're going to try to access our deepest truths. And our current ontology holds unity as an aspiration. It's something we have to keep trying for, and maybe someday, if we're really lucky, we'll get there. But what we want to clarify today is unity is not merely something that we wish and hope for against all odds. Unity is our existential reality. So our work today is reestablishing that truth. And so the first round with our panelists is going to lay out those foundational principles and the scientific breakthroughs that firmly establish that integration, indivisibility, and interlinkage are our ontological ground. In other words, unity not as an aspiration, but unity as just what's so. And the second round, we're going to build on that foundation. We're going to ask that if unity is just what's so, by virtue of our indisputable interdependence with everything and everybody on the planet, and so what? What does it mean to reground in a new, more fact-based, more unitive worldview? And with us today is cosmologist and author of Cosmic Hologram and the upcoming story of Gaia, Jude Currivan. Also evolutionary biologist, former department head of the Natural History Museum in Manhattan, and so many other things well worth Googling, Kurt Johnson. Jonathan Granoff is our third panelist. He's the president of Global Security Institute, an expert in nuclear disarmament, a former Nobel Prize candidate, and the representative for the Summits of Nobel Laureates. We want to give a special thanks to our ECOSOC co-sponsors, the Cosmos Associates, United Religions Initiative, Peace Now, and We the World. So we want to give a special thanks to partners, including our Evolutionary Leaders SDG Thought Leaders Circle, Unity Earth, and the National Peace Academy. So we'll start with Jude, just laying out some basics, some bedrock foundation for unity. Jude, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joni. Hi, everyone. Well, to begin with, as Joni was starting to share, the presumptions of the secular science of materialism and separation that's hitherto been essentially the prevalent worldview and narrative are being found to be fundamentally flawed. And instead, the evidence of new scientific breakthroughs at all scales of existence and across numerous fields of research is revealing an understanding of the unified nature of reality, showing an inherent meaning and evolutionary purpose embodied by our entire universe, and thus in our planetary home Gaia and us, and the realization that we're inseparable from each other and the entirety of reality, and which has enabled a unitive narrative to emerge, aiming to provide an underpinning and a framing foundation to serve and support the conscious evolution of humanity and heal our collective worldview from separation to a perspective of unity in diversity. And this emergent understanding is revealing a cosmology of evolutionary consciousness. From the entire universe to planetary science, to evolutionary biology, to human social systems and behaviors, and to neuroscience, studies of noetic science, and much more, the evidence is now presenting a revolutionary and radical new guide to reality. Its discoveries also range from the most minute level of our universe at the so-named Planck scale to atoms, people and planets, to vast groups of galaxies and to the entirety of space. Key to this emergent cosmology of conscious evolution is that the appearance of our universe, its energy and matter, space and time, arises from deeper non-physical realms of causation, as digitized and vitally meaningful information. And its informed and non-locally unified reality manifests holographically with its innate wholeness, expressed in nested and relational and dynamic complexity of its differentiated and diverse parts. Its universally unified non-locality and non-physical has been a theoretical basis of quantum physics from the early insights into the quantization of energy matter. And progressively, such so-named non-local entanglement has been experimentally proven in labs, in laboratories, far above the quantum level and across distances of many miles. In 2018, though, a research team at MIT went much further. They were able to non-locally entangle photons in their lab with starlight from 600 light years away, and triggered, that entanglement triggered by light from a quasar, an incredibly active galactic center at a cosmological scale of 12.2 billion light years distant. And in 2012, an experiment
Jude, we've lost your sound.
Sorry, Joni, did you get that? Okay. What I was saying was that in 2012, an experiment by Beroux and Lutz and their team was able to demonstrate that deleting one bit of digitized information releases heat, physical heat, and the amount in line with theoretical predictions. In doing so, they showed that information is as physical as energy and matter. And indeed, other discoveries since, before and since, and crucially still unfolding, are revealing information as more fundamental and expressed as meaningful information is the all-pervasive and essential nature of reality itself. Further, extending from studies of black holes to the entire universe, a number of researchers have also developed the so-named holographic principle to model the four-dimensional appearance of our universe, 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, as a holographic projection of its 2-dimensional boundary of 1 dimension of space and 1 dimension of time. Backed up by complementary research on gravity and physical forces in general, the holographic universe has now become perhaps the leading and emergent perspective of cosmology. The holographic projection of the appearance of our universe is then entirely made up of meaningful information, pixelated at the Planck scale. So as space expands and time flows from its first moment, ever more information is able to be expressed, experienced, and evolved.
Jude, we've lost
you again.
Okay, thanks for the wave, Jonathan. I don't know why, I'm doing nothing. In 2017, a group of 5 university cosmology departments identified the characteristic informational patterns of the holographic principle in tiny temperature variations in the cosmic microwave background, or CMB, the relic radiation left over from a very early epoch of our universe and which fills the whole of space. These exact same informational and so named fractal patterns and relationships that are self-similar and scale up and scale down have been discovered in myriad phenomena, from the scale of atoms, where electrons cluster fractally, to planetary phenomena, including the shapes of coastlines and clouds and embedded in weather patterns and ecosystems. They continue to extend to our entire solar system, showing up in the solar wind, for example, the stream of charged particles continually emitted by our sun, and in the orbits of planets and moons, tracing fractal patterns in space-time. On vastly larger scales, still fractal patterns have been discovered in the clustering of great numbers of galaxies. So to move to the completion of this very brief summary of the evidence, expanding the 3 universal laws of thermodynamics to 3 laws of information or infodynamics also points the way to reconciling the physics of our entire universe and understanding how its life cycle evolves. It also reveals, when combined with other laws of physics, how there are instructions, informational algorithms instructing our universe how to exist and evolve, and are all inherently relational. Our universe is as simple as it can be, but no simpler, to meaningfully exist and embody an innate and evolutionary purpose. Beginning 13.8 billion years ago, not in the implicit chaos of a Big Bang, but as an incredibly ordered and extremely fine-tuned first moment of an ongoing big breath. As space expands and time flows, our universe thus exists to evolve from simplicity to complexity and diversity, ever greater levels of individuated and collective self-expression, self-awareness, and conscious interdependence and interbeing. In its ongoing emergence, the processes of biological evolution are also now being discovered to be not driven by random mutations, but informationally guided and in collaborative and co-evolutionary relationships, not only within Gaia's biological organisms, but throughout her entire planetary body. Numerous academic institutions, universities, and many, many thousands of leading edge scientists focusing on their own areas of expertise are also progressively following the evidence and arriving at the same perspective. Most fundamentally, there is a growing realization that is convergent with universal wisdom teachings and the tenets of inter-spirituality, that to understand the universe at its deepest levels calls for an acceptance that mind, sentience, and consciousness, universal mind, sentience, and consciousness, are the fundamental nature of reality, as also understood by many leading scientists. And as one of them, David Bohm, posited some 40.
Jude, you're muted again.
Okay.
David Bohm pointed out.
As David Bohm pointed out some 40 years ago, and now supported by increasingly compelling evidence and understandings I've very briefly touched upon, are now increasingly understood as being articulated as the meaningfully informed and holographic manifestation and evolutionary purpose of the whole world, and where we are its microcosmic co-creators.
Thank you. From cosmology to biology, Kurt.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So I'm actually going to be speaking about the landscape, both across the world's religions and in evolutionary science. And I'm going to be aiming them both in this context that Jude just talked about, is what is the significance now, where we are in history, which I'll be talking a lot about, with the impact of a unitive narrative that can actually become the focus of the way that global worldview can go. So as we progress here, as I chat, I want you to remember the interrelations of all the 17 SDGs, how interrelated and how diverse they are. I want you to keep in mind the 3 bullet points of this session: interdependence, indivisibility, and interlinkage. And because I'll be talking about the religions, I want you to remember the quote by Hans Kung when the UN was founded, that there could be no peace among the nations until there is peace among the religions. So as you all know, we go back millennia and in centuries with religions, worldviews, and ideologies being the basis of cultural and personal identities. And that's resulted in centuries of conflict and war. If we look at any developmental histories of the world, be it spiral dynamics, integral, or Julian James's work at Princeton, we see this long journey of conflict and war, which has been ameliorating a bit over time, but it's a really, really slow go. And much of that is because of the identities that are across the cultural milieus with regard to religion, worldview, and ideology. Now, in the midst of that, in the last 130 years, we've had a truly dynamic interfaith movement globally. The Parliament of World Religions and so many other activities that have been all about these different religions and ideologies, worldviews, knowing about each other, being conversant about each other, and also having a toleration and a coexistence mentality. And out of that, then in the last 25 years, we've had the interspiritual movement, which Jude mentioned, which then has asked everyone to drop deeper from the head to the heart, into the world of the mystics, into the world of the quantum realm, which science is now discussing, and go deeper to understand this profound interconnection that we're talking about. So the early writers and visionaries of that interspiritual movement, if you go back to Thomas Merton, Raymond Panikar, B. Griffiths, Wayne Teasdale, Matthew Fox, the Dalai Lama, and my own book in 2013, what we were really looking toward and what we were expecting was the chance for the world to have what's been called the great intersubjective dialogue, the one that we've never really had between all the isms. We actually thought that this could happen and was a next step in history. But actually something else has actually happened, and it's really twofold, and that's how I'm going to end this first section on the world religions. What's actually happened is disaffiliation on the one hand, that instead of people becoming more deeply involved in the religions, they became less involved, disaffiliated completely, and maybe, and especially in the younger generation, have little to no knowledge of at all of the great wisdom traditions, which is a tragedy. Or on the other hand, the religions, because of identity and power and structures, money, all the whole thing, have remained just as embedded around the world as the cultural loci between countries and nations, and particularly because of identities. So what's interesting right now is historically, we're really on a precipice between that old and that new. The old is business as usual, everything that's embedded, everything that's habitual, and the fact that most people in their lives are so busy, they often can't reflect deeply enough to go to these places where they could understand the visions that were really called the new, which are everything about interconnection and interdependence, indivisibility, and interlinkage, which are completely transparent in the mystical traditions and the real meanings of the world religions, and also completely transparent in in what's going on in cosmology and physics. So now, if we're going to journey over then to evolutionary science, here we've had some really, really major developments that Jude also pointed to. As you know, in the 1850s, when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and then we inherited what became known as survival of the fittest. All of our politics, all of our business, all of our economics operates in the Shark Tank mentality of survival of the fittest, and that the definition of fitness is who is the best competitor. Now, what happened in about 2015, 2016, due to supercomputers and new methods of study that could study how groups make decisions, science discovered, and it now is the mainstream, that groups don't make decisions in the same way individuals do. Individuals make selfish decisions, of course, based on self-protection, survival, on and on. But when groups make decisions, both in nature and culturally, they tend to always make them for the good of the whole. So what happened then is that evolutionary science shifted to a cooperative view of evolution rather than a competitive view of evolution, understanding that competition is the definition of fitness only at the most primitive levels of a system. But as a system complexifies, and this of course would include cultural evolution, then it becomes all about cooperation. So those areas now in evolutionary biology are called group and multi-level selection. And it's absolutely proven without a doubt, like E.O. Wilson at Harvard said, everything else is commentary, that when groups make decisions, they make them for the good of the whole. Now, what science also discovered, and this is my last part, as they were studying group phenomena, is how altruism evolves, how goodness evolves. Science had not understood this before. It didn't even know whether altruism actually existed. So now that we understand that groups of multi-level selections always choose for the good of the whole, we can understand at the personal level and the collective level how altruism evolves. And so actually, the decision now of mainstream evolutionary biology is that nature itself and cultural evolution are trying to move toward a planetary altruism, an altruism at a global level that serves the world that works for all, of course, which is the motto of the SDGs, and also, for the good of the whole. Now, the last point is this: the difficulty now that's arisen, which is similar to the old and new that I mentioned in religion, is that still much of the scientific community now that understands group and multi-level selection and understands the evolution of altruism are basically still all in their own worldviews materialists. They either don't know the cosmology because they aren't physicists, or they've long ago dismissed spirituality and religion, and academia, particularly in the mainstream academia, pretty much prohibits anybody from delving into consciousness, spirituality, or those kinds of phenomena. So then, last point, we're really then in the same situation in the sciences as we are with the religions, that we're on this precipice, this amazing threshold of the old and the new. And the old, as Jude and so many others say, is separation thinking, and the new, which is unitive consciousness and understanding the absolute interrelationship and interdependence of everything. So that's the mantra that we feel can actually have a major impact with regard to people seeing not only the directions we can go in our thinking, but the directions we can go in our work that can have actually real impact. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate one of the points you made is that the evolutionary biological breakthrough understanding now is that survival of the fittest is not really true once you get past these really simple organisms. Survival of the best cooperators is what's true, because in a unified system, cooperating all together is what makes it work.
Yeah, and the way scientists say that is survival of the fittest is true, but the definition of fitness changes with complexity. So the definition of fitness in a complex system like a culture is who's the best cooperator, not who's the best competitor.
Thank you. Jonathan, take us forward.
Well, we're convened around addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have within the UN system, within the international system, a model based on the centrality of the security of the nation state. Now, the nation state arose because in the 17th century in Europe, a theory of the purpose of human life and another theory were in such conflict that there was enormous slaughter going on. So Protestants' definition of Jesus' love and how it's realized, and Catholic definitions led people to be slaughtering each other, up to a third of the population in Central Europe. And in order to separate them, the nation state as an institution was created at the Councils of Westphalia. So the UN is an institution, the UN, which created the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, has over 190 different nations, like a dog with 190 leashes pulling in different directions. It's an atomized approach to governance. But it also says in the charter, the peoples of the world. So there's another way of looking at it, which is the entirety of the human family. And that's a unified concept. And it's now clear to us that science has revealed that 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton, a single cell organism in the oceans. So if any of us lost a lung, we could survive. But if we lose the third lung of the oceans, we will not survive. And we now know that the health of the oceans depends on the pH, the alkaline acidic balance of the oceans, which depends on the climate of the planet, which depends upon the application of science and technology on how we heat our homes, drive our cars, and live. So the very breath that each of us is taking is integrated holistically with the way in which we move our bodies and heat our homes. I'm just giving one simple example of this principle of integration. But our ideology is based on military nationalism, the security of the state, not the security of people. And even in some doctrines, the security of the weapons that secure the state. So the nuclear posture review of my country says that we want to make sure that the weapons are safe and secure, not that the people are safe and secure. Well, this comes about from an epistemology that's very reductionist, that as Dr. Johnson just pointed out, it comes about from a worldview of atomized thinking and a misinterpretation of evolution. That competition at the coarsest level is the core order of the universe. But this very breath doesn't operate that way. We are interdependent with the phytoplankton, not to mention the rainforests. So a different approach is being mainstreamed in governance, and it's called human security. So I'm actually a fellow and a trustee of the World Academy of Art and Science. It was started by Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell and people of that caliber because they realized the footprint of modern science and its ability to impact the natural world was unprecedented, and that there are national academies of science, but we needed art. And the art they were talking about were the arts of the humanities, the arts of our culture, the arts of the wisdom traditions of the world. And the wisdom traditions of the world, which pursue understanding why we're here, have come up with an answer since time immemorial of a unity and a purpose, a why for our existence. So, depending on which tradition you might want to pick, you can always find this principle. The Upanishads asserts this essential oneness, the ancient Hindu scriptures of South Asia. And in fact, it states the human family is one as the manifestation of this unity. In the Quran, it literally states there's no fissure in existence. No fissure in existence. There's no division in existence itself. It's unified. And God is described as Kul hu Allahu ahad, of oneness. And if there's only one reality, we can't possibly be separate from it. And in the Jewish Christian tradition, the core affirmation of the purpose and reality is Adonai Echad. The reality is one. Well, one means one. So it's mysterious, because if there is only one, then where does my consciousness and my breath and my existence begin? And how does it relate to the one? So great thinkers have tried to describe this principle in many ways. One way that I find useful is every wave on the ocean is unique and separate in a way, but it only waves for a short time, and then it returns to its ultimate reality, that it is the ocean. The great mystic Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi said, you can think of it as many faces in one mirror, or one face in many mirrors, but it comes up pretty much the same way. Now, a human security approach, rather than military nationalism, would say that we need to address the global threats that threaten all humanity in a cooperative way, or else we're unable to address them. And thus we will not survive. So we're at a unique moment in history in which the practical and the morally insightful converge. You cannot protect the climate at a national level. We cannot protect against viruses, pandemics at a national level. We cannot protect the rainforests, the rest of the what provides every breath, at a national level. We can only do it at a holistic level. And that's what's missing in the SDGs. They are siloed because of this conflict of perception. And we are saying, let's resolve the conflict. Let's be realistic. Science tells us that we are interdependent with the natural world as a human species. The deeper science tells us that ontologically, existence is integrated. But that gets mysterious. That gets beyond the mechanics of basic engineering that people understand to be science. That's just the application of science. Science is a way of knowing. And that way of knowing has many dimensions. At the level that Dr. Johnson pointed out at the beginning, it is mechanical, but at the deeper level, it's not. And let me just end with an example of why this is important. If I were to take a handful of rose seeds and burn them, it would be accurate to say the purpose of the rose seeds is to give off heat and light and turn into carbon, because that's what happened. But that wouldn't reveal that if we took the rose seed and put it in the soil and allowed sunlight to shine on it, that it could produce beauty and fragrance. And the human being is exactly the same. If the human being is treated coarsely, without respecting the inherent dignity of every human being, they can end up not realizing the potential beauty and fragrance of being human. And that's what the SDGs are about. The SDGs are about ensuring that the seed of every human being can manifest the intrinsic beauty, dignity, and fragrance of being human. But this can only take place if we are realistic. And what science is telling us is that the nation state is an important institution, no doubt. But the reality that we have to live with is our integration as a human family. So this is the moment in which we have to be realistic, heed the insights of the wise and the practical application of science. And last but not least, the ethical articulation of that unity is found in the Golden Rule. That's the application of it. And it's in every single religion. it is time that we apply, and we know that if you don't apply it in your personal life, you'll be miserable. If you don't treat people with dignity, you will lose your own inherent dignity. If you treat others with loving kindness and dignity, you will realize your own dignity. The same is true with nations. If nations pursue domination over one another, we all lose. It's time that we applied the principle that nations must treat other nations as they want to be treated. This is part of what our community has to demand of our own nations and the nations of the world. The SDGs, when they're focused on human security, not just the security of states, but the security of humans. And part of human security, we know, is the fact that within our very skin is an entire biological system of many different kinds of lives. And as I pointed out, our very breath depends upon other forms of life. So the human thread of life is part of a fabric of great diverse lives. And we, as humans, to think that we're separate from this web of life is like thinking that the purpose of the rose seed is just to give off heat and light and become carbon. No, when we are realistic, and only when we are realistic, will we realize the fullness of our humanity.
Thank you, Jonathan. You know, you said just a beautiful, all three, thank you for setting such a great foundation. I like to show this graphic of the Sustainable Development Goals. The white space in between is what we're talking about. They exist as a to-do list on top of the reality of that we are a unified whole. And that reality, that white space is ignored. And that's what we're trying to open up and set our space on today. And so we wanted to just talk a little bit with you who are here about what you've just heard for a couple of minutes. We're going to open up for a much longer dialogue after we go around for a second round with our panelists. But does anyone in the room have any thoughts or questions they'd like to share? If you can use the hand raising feature, that would be great. And if not, we'll roll on to the second part of our panel. I'm just looking. Anyone have any thoughts about this basic ontological reality of our unity? Martha, please unmute yourself.
I would like to congratulate the speakers in creating an integrated approach through all the disciplines that point to what is for us today common sense. And I invite just further discussion, however the information flows, on how to produce a more integrated, not necessarily, you gave a very good description of how to look at the SDGs from an integrated point of view. Now, in terms of applying to their complex realization, would love to hear more from you at some point on that, however way this program unfolds. But thank you.
That's where we're headed. Thank you, Martha. That's
Thank you
exactly
so
where
much.
we're headed on our second round.
So happy.
We've just laid the what. You know, the what is that our existential reality is that we're interdependent, we're unified.
To my
And
dearest
we're gonna move into
friends.
the so what in a second.
You did it
Daniel.
beautiful.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for those great presentations, the three of you, in condensing a lot of very complex ideas into just a very short presentation. I'm sure any one of you could have gone on and given us a great deal more, if time permitting. I just wanted to comment, Joni, on your comment about what we're talking about is the white space. And maybe I don't understand that well, but I think we're not just talking about the white space. I think we're talking about inside each of those boxes too.
Yes.
And that how we approach each of these SDGs, whether it's about education or climate or energy or water or governance or what have you, I think they have to all embody the unitive narrative, even though the white space seems to imply a shared field of thought or shared field of perspective that then permeates. So I don't want to get just at the boundary of stuff. I really think this stuff needs to be taken into the very heart of what actually gets done and how it, and most importantly, how it gets done when we pursue these SDGs.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. You know,
I'd
when
like
I
to
use this in
respond.
speaking, I also say it's in of and through all the blocks. It's
Yeah.
not just between. Jonathan.
I'd like to respond to that. So the world spent nearly $2 trillion last year on military expenditures in the pursuit of security by the threat of force, the ultimate threat of force being the nuclear arsenals. The United States has recently pledged to fully modernize and upgrade its arsenal in an amount close to that $2 trillion over time, which has led 8 other countries to similarly squander enormous resources and institutionalize adversity. So this model of the pursuit of security through military nationalism cannot be ignored. I mean, it's one thing to, don't tell me your values, show me your budget. And in the places where decisions are made, despite the public proclamations that the nations are pursuing strategic stability as a way of balancing power so we'll be secure, or the SDGs, which really call for cooperation, in the places domestically where decisions are really made, those who disagree with us argue as follows. Yes, we need to fulfill the SDGs. We need to address the gross disparities of wealth. We need, for our self-interest, to have human security and address pandemics, etc. But the precondition for addressing all of those issues is peace. And the way peace is to be obtained is based on the Roman adage, which has no scientific basis whatsoever: prepare for peace, receive war. Thucydides' dilemma, that weakness breeds instability, which breeds war. Prepare for war, receive peace. Overwhelming power, military power, brings peace. Now, this is totally mythical thinking, and it's based on what Dr. Johnson pointed out is the coarse understanding of evolution. And it is inaccurate analysis. But that projection of this misinterpretation of Darwin, this misinterpretation of history, is what prevails in the domestic debates of every major country. And thus, there are no ministers of sustainable development goals, but there are ministries of enormous power, influence, with think tanks robustly funded by those who have an interest in it, professorships at universities based on military domination. I was, a few years ago, I spoke at Oxford because they're trying to get funding for a chair in peace studies. And I began and said, for the last 300 years, there's been a chair in war studies, and it's been very successful. This is the change that we need to make. We need to see that the model of cooperation is the model of security. And that's done as common security amongst nations. And the best way to do it is to pursue the positive vision of a world that works for everybody inherent in the SDGs. And we need to institutionalize those values. And part of that is the critique of the philosophical presumptions, mythologies, and foundations out of which this dysfunctional approach remains with us. A 17th century governance model, a horse and buggy road addressing religious violence, is still the basis of how we do global security. A dated model of evolutionary biology and a model of physics that since Einstein is no longer considered, is no longer applied in the real world. So we're dealing with myths, and we want to move to realism.
Thank you. That's a great setup for part 2 of our dialogue today. And before we move into that, part 2 is really to go into the more of an imaginal and a possibility space. If this is so, then what's possible? And before we really move into that space in terms of all of our wonderful intellectual presenting, I want to just take a moment to get down into our hearts about this and just take a moment to breathe together. And just imagine a world that's organized on a basis of truly understanding that we are one unified whole world. Imagine a world really geared, founded on unity principles so that it does work for everyone. What would shift for you? How would a resituating of the work on the SDGs shift your work? What would be the global ramifications of resituating ourselves on an ontology of unity, on a basic understanding that we are not fragmented nations, we are one world? And so now that we've established our scientific and our philosophical ground and really demonstrated interlinkages, we're going to go around with the panel one more time, starting with Jude again, to take us into the so what, into the possibility zone. Based on this, what does our existential indivisibility mean in terms of development, in terms of realizing the SDGs? Jude?
Thanks, Joni. I'd just like to sort of go back and sort of run round what Jonathan and Kurt has said, because essentially our worldviews, our mindsets, our cultures underpin and frame the narratives we share. And so our values, the choices we make, and our consequential behaviors, everything drives from that in an inherent feedback loop. Our behaviors and the experiences that we accrue then also can moderate our subsequent choices, our values, our mindsets, our worldviews, and reshape our narratives. So we're in this dynamic process of how we think is how we act. And if we are led by a prevalent worldview of materialist separatism, then we will act accordingly. And that's the loop we've been in, as Jonathan said, for some hundreds of years. It's based on a scientific paradigm and worldview of materialism, separation, and a universe, crucially, that is bereft of meaning and inherent purpose. And it's prevailed until now. And so it's accordingly embodied in our structures, our governance, our education, our healthcare, our organizations, everything we do, and therefore the SDGs accordingly. So it's really pulling back to that fundamental reperception. Now we have the science for it at cosmological levels and every which way down across all fields of research, that this is not the case, that instead our universe does exist and evolve as a unified entity with meaning and inherent purpose. Now, as Albert Einstein was famously said, we can't solve a problem from the same mindset that created it. So this understanding of unity in diversity and a unitive narrative to frame it really is central to whether, and if so, how we can change our worldview and accordingly amend our values and transform our behaviors. Ultimately, if that's possible, we can begin to embody the golden rule. And I would just add to what Jonathan spoke of, and it is universal, is not just treat each other as we wish to be treated, but to treat our planetary home and all her children as we would wish to be treated. So I'd just like to expand a little bit more on why I think this matters so what, because often, science is viewed as something either very small, very big, and somewhere distant. And really what the science now is showing is that the same underlying informational patterns that I described earlier, and the emergence of a cosmology of evolutionary consciousness is also discovering the same informational patterns and processes that have been found from atoms to ecosystems to the whole universe is also revealing themselves through our collective behavior. Essentially, studies of movements of stock market prices, internet traffic, website links, data routes. The internet itself has shown that they embody the same patterns as do rainforests and weather patterns. We cannot separate ourselves from the natural world, and we cannot think it's out there or big or small. It's actually underpinning our collective choices and behaviors. And linking such so-called natural and human patterns further, in 2015, astrophysicists discovered that galaxies form in the same way that cities do. When we look at population densities of galaxies in the sense of the number of their stars and cities in the number of their people, they literally embody the same informational patterns. But a crucial example, because I think it pertains to what Jonathan said and what the SDGs are all about, is that essentially researchers have even now uncovered associated relationships known as power laws that link the frequency and destructive power of earthquakes to the frequency and destructive power in the terms of fatalities of human conflicts. Analysis has shown that when we plot hundreds of earthquakes, there's a fundamental relationship between how powerful they are and their frequency. In other words, an earthquake that's twice as powerful is 4 times less likely to happen. When researchers have done the same analysis of human conflicts from over 3 centuries, world wars to regional problems to insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, they found exactly the same relationships between their frequencies and their power in terms of fatalities. Now, what that says is whereas a worldview and a mindset of separation render such conflicts as apparently natural norms, if we can change our worldview and narrative and evolve our mindset from our unsustainable state to one that remembers the unified nature of reality, just as our collective consciousness underpins our current behaviors, so our collective consciousness can evolve to underpin different behaviors. And when that happens, with a worldview based on the emergent science, with a narrative that is unitive and convergent, with universal spiritual traditions and wisdom teachings, then we can literally link up and lift up together to transform our world. And as Kurt said, our entire planetary story has been one of evolution from simplicity to complexity, which embodies collaborative relationships at every scale. And those collaborative relationships are balanced between healthy competition and cooperative complexity. And at every time when the emergence of complexity has happened, it's through such cooperations, from single cells to multi-celled, to ultimately to all the beautiful abundance that Gaia has birthed to us, as Jonathan said, a collaborative, cooperative of 37 trillion cells. This is the story of our universe. This is the story of our planet, and this is the story of us. And if we can wake up literally to remember we're inseparable, then literally we turn around 180 degrees from a worldview and a narrative of materialism separation to a worldview and narrative of unity. And unity in diversity, and beyond that, unity in inclusion, and beyond that, to a remembered unity in knowing that we belong to each other, to Gaia, to our entire universe, and to the entire cosmos. So this, for me, it's very broad, I know, but it's in a visceral level, it seems to me, in our hearts, in our gut. We know this at a very, very deep level. We know this. Young people are telling me, why aren't we taught this? And this is a crucial part of the work I think we're all doing, and with SGD4 is crucial. So I think this, it seems very broad, but it goes from the think cosmic to the feel global to the act local, because that's how I perceive that we can actually undertake this integral, interdependent, linking up and lifting up together to literally, revolutionarily and transform our world.
Thank you, Jude. I love lifting up the idea of belonging. You know, that's really where we come down. This is that we belong to one another, to the earth, and that's such a basis for a new narrative, new way of thinking. Kurt, the floor is yours.
All right, so Jude, thank you so much for ending on that point, because I'm going to make 4 points, and I wanted to remind everybody that I'm kind of assuming that you already heard what we already said about the modern view of evolution, which Jude just recounted. And actually, if you Google everything else is commentary, you can actually Google it, and it will come up as E.O. Wilson at Harvard and David Sloan Wilson at State University of New York saying, this is how we understand it now, everything else is commentary. And the only other one you'll find like that is Rabbi Hillel commenting on the golden rule, that everything else is commentary. So that's how prevalent this is today. Now, that's what leads to my first point. In that context, what I find stunning is that if science has decided that even nature itself, and certainly therefore cultural evolution, is trying to drive toward a planetary altruism, all that's standing in its way is other crazy pathological ideas by human beings, be they Donald Trump, be they Vladimir Putin, be they whoever they may be. But that is stunning, that if we were not in the way with other crazy to pathological ideas, the direction group selection and multi-level selection would take would be toward the good of the whole. So that's the first point. Second one is that this is a really, really complex landscape. We certainly have made that clear, not only the SDGs, but every aspect of this conversation that we've recounted and you all in your feedback. But permeating that now globally is this unitive message of all kinds. We are not the only ones that are putting out there some kind of a unitive message grounded either in science, grounded in the wisdom traditions, grounded just even in love and sociological relationships. And there are meetings like this going on all around the world. Last weekend, there was a huge meeting in Austin called by Emerge. We had 3 people there. If you saw the guest list, it was so many well-positioned people asking the same question that we're asking: how do we make an impact in this situation? So that brings me to my third point. And my third point is that all of us are working in our own constituencies to try to create effective impact networks that can actually get this message out in a way that not only proliferates in civil society, but could have the possibility to penetrate what we call that concrete ceiling of polity and politics and economics, where the old paradigm is so embedded that no matter how these views are seen in civil society, very often you cannot break through to how policy is made or where decisions are made. Now, so impact networks, the very people that are a part of this today, the evolutionary leaders, Sustainable Development Goals Thought Leaders Circle, of which we're all a part, John Raymer, who's getting this out across 100 Facebook pages from the Evolutionary Leaders Media Network, Media Synergy Circle. So we certainly at the ELs are working to try to become as impactful network as we can. And I know that that's what all of you are doing. And actually, if you get on Google and you actually even start Googling new books on impact networks, you're going to see there are all kinds of new advices out there about how we can get this job done. All right, so just 2 last points. So what's really interesting, if we're going to get somewhere relative to how impact networks can actually help this move forward, we're really going to have to be moving on 2 different levels. One is we're going to have to be moving at that level of civil society where the average Joe Public or Josephine Public is starting to think in the way that we're talking about, starting to think in this unitive way. But the other thing we've got to do, and there was a statement by 200 scholars just a week ago about this, we have to figure out the ways to penetrate the old domination hierarchies. The domination hierarchies that run this world with regard to gender and money and first, second, third world, go through the whole list. They're often so embedded we don't even see them. So I point you to Riane Eisler's work at the Center for Partnership Consciousness at University of Minnesota. Riane Eisler, her famous books, David Corton and all of his books, and many, many others who we work with. The scholars who wrote this statement about a week ago, they said, if we actually can't address the domination hierarchies, everything else will not get us there, because those are what block us, just like in America, in the sense of everybody who won't testify at January 6th, won't even answer a subpoena, because if they can get around it, they will. So no accountability, no way to move up the ladder. Okay, last point. And this is a difficult one, and that is that this is Elizabeth Sartoros's metaphor of the piano keyboard. In other words, the way that people are landing on worldviews are like a piano keyboard. And some people are way over here and some people are way over here. They're based from science, they're based from the wisdom traditions, they're based from their own personal experience. And there's often very little overlap between the dialogues or the ontological understandings in those parts of the keyboard. But we've got to be able to work toward the world that works for all and the group level selections that are for the good of the whole, even if our worldviews are drastically different. So I'll end with a final example. I recently did a program with 2 New York Times bestselling authors on Voice America. One was a neuroscientist, New York Times bestselling author, PhD, Harvard, all that. The other was a standard evolutionary biologist. And here's where they divided. It was on this divide between who's okay with consciousness and spirituality and who is still abjectly, as Dr. Jude Currivan just said, insisting on materialism. So the person who was still embedded in the materialism had this list of everything that we value in the spiritual traditions and said, none of these things are real, get over it. If we're going to actually move the global conversation forward, get over all that, it isn't real. Immediately, the neuroscientist said to him, all of these things that you just said aren't real, are real, get over it. So we're at this really interesting impasse, which I hope goodwill will get us by. If we're able to work together toward that world that works for all, no matter where we land on the keyboard in our worldview, even if those worldviews are like this, we've got to be able to get the job done. So my thanks to everybody, particularly the EL SDG Circle, Daniel, others that are on, Scott, Rhonda, people who put this program together, because this message is so important to possibly driving a new energy into this conversation.
Thank you. We have a wonderful question from Julie that I want to get to after Jonathan's. Jonathan.
Yeah, I would like to add a little poetry to our discussion on specifically what we just heard. Measuring ink on paper, the size and structure of each letter, even the paper's fabric itself. Will we know the meaning of the words? Measuring the bones, the skin, the nation, the planet, the solar system, all the galaxies. Will we know the meaning of the measurements? Will we find and know soul? Measuring all these gestures, will it be known, this immeasurable love? So I had a friend who was a mentor to me in this subject, Hans-Peter Dürr. Now, Hans-Peter Dürr was one of the people who, with Heisenberg, developed quantum mechanics. He was the director of the Max Planck Institute, one of the great physicists of our time. And we were by the bay in San Francisco one day, and he said, so if you take a net that cannot catch a fish smaller than 2 inches, you might say, well, The bay doesn't have fish smaller than 2 inches. In other words, the methodology and the tools of your scientific method and what you're looking for determines largely the outcome of your measurements. A great Sufi story by Baba Muhyiddin was there was a scientist with a frog, and he was yelling to the frog, "Jump, frog," and the frog jumped, and he wrote down, "Frog with 4 legs jumps 4 feet." And they cut off 2 of the legs. "Jump, frog. Frog with 2 legs jumps 2 feet. Frog with 1 leg jumps 1 foot. Frog with no legs goes deaf." So there's so much of science dependent on what is being looked for. And if we're looking for the why, science in terms of measurement and prediction and control may not be able to find it. It doesn't mean we can't know the why, because part of being human is that we are creatures that have meaning and value as part of the architecture of our existence. That might be true for many creatures too, because every mammal that's born, every mother mammal loves its offspring, and you can see that. And children who are not nurtured don't grow very well. But the fact is that part of our humanity has to do with the qualities that make us human, that we need meaning, we need a why. Without the why, you end up with law without justice, medicine without healing, financial systems disconnected from goods and services, religion without love and transcendence, philosophy without the pursuit of truth, science without understanding its own purpose, and weapons, the more you perfect them, the less security you obtain. The why is, discovering why is ontologically part of being human. And if we forget that, then we're not being realistic. So I come back to sort of a mantra I've been saying about this, that we're the realists. And we're rejecting the mythologies that modern science and common sense are demonstrating are dysfunctional. Doesn't work. Selfishness at a national level is inadequate to protect the climate. It doesn't work. So the only way of dealing with the current challenges to the human family is by ignorance, by ignoring them and denying the reality in front of us. Now, mythology has value. Things that telling stories about things that can't be measured can have value if we're talking about things that are immeasurable. But mythology is not very good if you're dealing with things that can be measured. So our relationship with the natural world has to rest on the science. It's fine to believe metaphorically that we can fly, but you can't jump off of the roof of a building, because the reality is gravity is going to take over. And similarly, we can no longer live with the myth that we can live with the focus of security on military nationalism. We have to change how we define security. And I come back to the fact that the diplomats of the world at the UN, at the General Assembly, have said we must make human security central. The Secretary General has said he has to mainstream it. So there is a political, social ideology that can get us out of the conundrum of national militarism. And I think that's very important in order to fulfill the SDGs, in order to free up the resources. But again, and I totally agree with Kurt's emphasis on changing culture and Jude's emphasis on a collective movement of the heart and soul and intellect, because in the very charter of the UN, in Section 5, Article 26, it says the Security Council not may, but shall convene the military staff committees to reduce expenditures on arms and free up resources for social development. This is a duty in the charter. It's not a resolution that can be vetoed. It's not a General Assembly resolution that's precatory. It says that it shall do that, and it's never been done. So we don't have a lack of a legal basis for this change. What we have is a lack of political will. And the lack of political will is that these old horse and buggy approaches are providing enormous wealth and power to a small group of people. And that's the dilemma. And last but not least, why do ideas matter? Well, I'm a lawyer by training. I've been a law professor, and one of the and our Western legal system is largely based on the concept of property, of owning and dominating aspects of the natural world. And one of the indicia of property is the right of destruction. So if you own a forest, you can cut it down. I live in a house. I can burn it down. I don't have to give it to my children. Now, in the United States, until pretty recently, people believed they could own other people, that they could treat them as property. And that's not even resolved in law until the civil rights laws of the 1960s. So it's quite recently that the principle of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. So even owning people, just grasp this, owning people is part of the concept of property. But we can't treat the global commons as our property. Simply can't treat the oceans, the air we breathe, the rainforest, the topsoil, the water, as something we have a right to destroy. It's both practically wrong and it's ontologically wrong. That's where we're going. It's wrong in terms of truth. The truth is we don't own it. We're here for a short time to discover the meaning of why we're here. And the gift of space and time of our lives is a gift of love. And we didn't make the world we live in. We didn't make ourselves. We didn't make our own minds and consciousness. I mean, if anybody's listening who thinks that they did make the world, you need help. Think for a second. Did you make the next breath you have? It's a gift. And the proper response to a gift is thank you. That's realistic. But if we're completely distracted by things that are distracting us from simply breathing and understanding our own existence, we will lead lives of desperation. And coming back to just breathing and being and understanding our reality is really what we're talking about. So we're not imagining, Joni. We are saying, let's get real.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah. I want to move on to Julie's question. We just have a few minutes left, so we'll ask panelists to stay short on their responses. But to frame this question about the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN was functioning at such a high level that coming up with 17 discrete goals that the entire world agreed on, it's a world to-do list, that was a breakthrough. And now the breakthrough that's needed is to come back to the holistic view again. Right, we needed to get to this place of delineation. It was an important place to get to itemize these goals. But now we need to get back to that, the point Daniel brought forward, that we're not going to realize one without realizing them all. They're all fractals of one another, and Scott brought that through. So that being the case, how would the work on the SDGs up level if we could all move on to this much more unitive ground of being? And I'm going to ask you to go really quickly because we have a hand up and another big question that I'd like to get to in the chat box. Anyone want to take that on?
I'll start, Joni, if that's okay.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the question, Julie. I think it's key. I mean, as a number of us know, we actually have a unitive narrative synergy circle whose emphasis is how do we get a unitive narrative out as widely as possible, shared as widely as possible, as Kurt said, by everyone, Joe and Josephine in the street, whoever and wherever. Because I don't just think this is an approach to the United Nations. I think, how do we engage civil society as widely as possible? Going back to the point I mentioned earlier about the youth saying, why aren't we taught this? So I think there are many, many, convergent and parallel ways forward here. But also to say that we've got a 12th of July meeting where we are looking to invite a number of ECOSOC NGOs together to see if we can perhaps form a thematic cluster at the UN based on unity, based on unitive narrative, because that gives us then a much more powerful entree into those discussions. And there are folks at very senior levels and throughout the United Nations themselves who also have this worldview, who also have this perspective. So how can we engage them? But I think the key thing goes back to what Jonathan was saying. How do we get over or transcend, include and transcend the sense of a nation states into a global community? So I think we've got our work cut out, but I do think there's a realization now that this is how we have to move forward if we're going to move forward at all. So I think there's a traction, I think there's a momentum, and I think we're on our way.
Okay, I'm going to pass because I would love to hear from the people in the audience and the other hands that are up.
Joni, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I want to go to this first question by Nadalija that I hope I'm not butchering your name, but how do we now move this onto this worldview? How do we return to the sacred? These are huge questions. We can't really answer all of these here, but I think it comes down to that we have to relocate this conversation, relocate it onto this more truthful basis. And I think we've spoken to that throughout, and I think you may have gotten here a little late, but if anyone wants to touch on that briefly before we move on to Deborah, who has her hand up.
Yeah, I want to. 60 years ago, when there was discussions about the gross disparities of wealth on the planet, people advocated development, industrial development, basically. Today, development always has an adjective before it. It's been embodied in specific legal cases. The Danube River case was the one for the international law and national legal systems. And the term sustainable development now is part of the framework that even the most gross violators of it, some multinational corporations in the oil industry, will pay the price of hypocrisy for it. But most people take it seriously. And it's part of Article 4 of the SDGs. Children all over the world are taught sustainable development as a principle they have to apply in their countries. Similarly, the concept of human security has to become mainstreamed so that we see that security is a global human public good. And that goes to goal number 16, and holding governments and all institutions accountable to the principle of sustainable development and to the principle of human security. So what does that mean? Well, sustainable development, we're seeing in universities all over the world. We want to make our university green. We're seeing that the central banks of the world this year in Glasgow said, in reporting requirements, you have to report on your loan systems how it affects the climate. There's regulations before the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States on climate impact. We're going to lose it because of the recent court decisions in the US, but the movement for sustainable development has momentum. Sustainability has been mainstreamed. We need to mainstream human security and hold governments under Article 16 of the SDGs accountable to applying that rather than military nationalism.
And we need to mainstream the basis for understanding the unity that our existential interdependence, that we will never come to SDG realization until we base our understanding on that. and not treat these as 17 different things that maybe some countries will do and some won't. Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this amazing gathering. I'm a mediator, and I have been working for 33 years with the constructs within the simplicity of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The physical needs, safety and economic needs, belonging, which is where all conflict shifts, self-esteem, dignity, and self-actualization. And I've been working also that the simple triangle of those needs can inherently contain all the 17 development goals, as the sustainable development goals, but also his primary triangle is a fractal that can be extrapolated to families, to nations, to the international community, to nature. And his primary one everyone's familiar with, he calls the deficiency need, where people feel deficient and have to go outside themselves to conquer the environment to get the needs met. Whereas he inferred, but didn't really put on a grid, what he calls the growth hierarchy of needs. And I spent years like extrapolating his writings to see what does the growth hierarchy look like. And that one is that 180, that I am not deficient. I am this being that came here miraculously, and I belong in an abundant cosmos. And here's how I'm going to conduct and meet physical needs, safety needs, belonging needs, etc. I would love to share some of my, work with you all on that. But I think that it creates a framework that really is based on the development of the brain, the evolution of brain development, these 5 stages, and on into more. I think it's something that any nation could basically agree with, because they can see, if people don't get their safety needs met, they're not going to get out of the, amygdala.
Deborah, I'm going to ask you to wind it up, please. We're really short.
Anyway, I just want to say, I want to share this with you because it might be a helpful toward this unitive framework that is non-ideological, but empirically observable, that we have
Thank
these needs. Thank you.
So we are really coming close to the end of time. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us a takeaway. And I would really appreciate if everyone here can stick a bullet in the chat of your takeaway. What are you taking from this? So we'll start with Jude. I'm sorry, we'll start with Jude.
Sorry,
Deborah,
Joni.
thank you for your input.
My takeaway is gratitude, actually. Gratitude for us being together, gratitude for this is the time. It just seems to me that this is the time whose understanding has come. This is the understanding whose time has come. So I'm just delighted we're all on this journey together, and really looking forward to just continuing to link up and lift up together as we go forward. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So as many of us have concluded in so many meetings like this, and we're all on the same page, all of us here, we just got to keep banging this same drum. This is the only drum that really holds out a possibility for us to get to a global cosmopolitan culture that actually works for all. So that's our only hope. And I'm just grateful to all of you for doing the parts of this that you're all doing.
Jonathan, the floor is yours.
One drop. No drop without cloud. No cloud without ocean. No ocean without drop. One drop joining heaven and earth. No life is separate.
Thank you. What a beautiful way to end. There's nothing to say from that, Jonathan. That pretty much puts it together. That is Jonathan's own writing, by the way.
It's in a book, Water Springs, which is published by the Peace project, Peace Pledge Project, on the centrality and necessity of water in all the different spiritual traditions. But we are the one drop, all of us.
Yes. So I'm going to end with just letting folks know that we are hoping to form a unity coalition, if not an actual formal unity cluster under the NGO major group. I put the link up there a little bit ago for any organizations that are interested in that discussion. And we are looking for ECOSOC or accredited, UN accredited organizations to be part of that, because that's what it takes to work in that UN mechanism. And so specifically, if you are that, or if you have boots on the ground at the UN, that's what we're looking for. That link is in the chat. Maybe someone can repost that right now to the form for coming together as a unity cluster. Excuse me. And we are doing a hybrid live and excuse me, a hybrid live and virtual event on next Tuesday. And that will be at the Sukyo Mahikari Center. Can someone please post that address and the time and everything in the chat box right now? We really hope to see everyone live on the ground. We'll talk about what this means, what the story means to going forward and working more deeply on the SDGs. We'll have some snacks and some time to really just connect with each other. And we will definitely drill down into this idea of forming a unity cluster, because the cluster mechanism under the NGO major group gives us an actual footing in the UN system to apply this to specific UN processes around the Sustainable Development Goals. It gives us, it's an open gate for civil society to actually have a presence at the UN, and where we can presence these distinctions of unity as our existential reality, where we can start to respond into the system directly from the viewpoint, from a unified worldview, and not from unity as a someday out there, maybe something, maybe if we're lucky and good enough, we'll get there, but unity as our fundamental basis. That's a profound shift. And in order to really, you know, when little things happen in a system, the system just absorbs it. But when we come together and really work as a unified cluster, then we have the opportunity to put some profound new things into the system, and we have a better chance for them to stick. So I thank everyone for being here today. I thank you for however you take this work out into your world and into your SDG work. I thank you especially for continuing, I put my email in there, for continuing to come back to us about how this might unfold in your work, about ideas you have for where we might bring this forward in the UN system. We are just beginning this dialogue, and we're thrilled that you've joined us for this part of it. And we really look forward to continuing it. So for now, I say thank you, everyone, and all the best. Have a wonderful high-level political forum. Bye-bye.